All right, in week 4, we've reached how the Irish actually saved civilization. So this is the point of Cahill's book, that they've in fact done it. And now we're going to explore in depth why that is the case, how they actually did it. In terms of the week, it looks busy, and there is a decent amount to do. I do want you to remember that even though it is a busy week, that we do finish this course essentially by the tour. So if you're stressed out, if you feel like it's a lot, remember that it's also a very condensed course. So the work that we're doing now will essentially free you up for more time later in the semester. Okay, the to-dos, 3 videos. So there's this video which you're watching now, there's the review of week 3, and there is minutes 29 through the end of the BBC video. So essentially 20 more minutes, 30 more minutes of that. A great video which will take you through the period of history that we end with this week. This is also the week we're going to transition from the Cahill book to next week, the Duty book. Okay, so the reading, How the Irish Saved Civilization, 155 through 196, takes you through the actual salvation part of it, and 210 through 218 talks about kind of the period after the salvation. Okay, as usual, you've got your 4 full submissions to the discussion boards, and as always, I encourage you to try to get them in earlier so that I can comment on them. I try to comment on as many as I can, but even if you do get them in late, I encourage you to review and to read the posts of your classmates, because you'll get a sense of what they're thinking, and you'll also get a sense of the comments I've made to them, and maybe some errors they've made, or some areas that they should think further, and that maybe you can contribute to with your post. This week we're also going to do a short assignment, so I put in the rubric and the explanation for that rubric. That was early on. There was a video about the rubric and about what's expected for the short assignment. I encourage you, if you want, to go back into the professor video folder and review that video. That will help you get a better grade. We do have another cultural event this week. So that is going to be Professor Andy Miller, who's going to discuss the Catholic-Protestant struggles in Ireland, Miranda Center, room 216, 5 p.m. on Thursday. So it should be a great event, and we will continue to learn more about Ireland. And also bring your raffle tickets and money and your passport to that day. We'll get some of that stuff done. The cultural event reflection, a number of you turned in your Sister Marguerite reflection, and if you didn't, it's just one page, what you thought was important, worthwhile, interesting. And again, even though if you couldn't be there, you've got the video, so you're still have a responsibility to do that. Hopefully you watched it during the snowstorm. Irish cultural reports. Okay, so pretty much everyone at this point has signed up for one particular moment of Irish history, and no one has turned in a video yet. So that, combined with talking to some of you and you stating your preference for giving an in-person presentation, we have another cultural event coming up, I believe, on February 2nd, and so I'll simply reserve time there for people to give their presentations in class, and then we'll do one more before we leave, and you can do it that way. If you want to do a video, send in the video, but if you want to do it in person, I'll sign up sheets for you on Thursday. The second quiz, most of you actually did the quiz, so for most of you it's already done and over with. And the first short assignment I have posted on the NU Learn homepage. One other point about the NU Learn homepage, I tried, when I put in pictures there, I always try to put in a picture that is meaningful, that is relevant. So take a look at that picture and think about why it's there, or pictures. This week, for example, we have 3 of them. Okay, so that is the deal in terms of the to-dos for this week. In terms of the reading and in terms of what we're going to talk about, okay, the way the Irish saved civilization is centrally connected to the monastic tradition in Ireland. So the monasteries were critical. And you can ask, why were they so important? Why were they so attractive to Ireland at that time? Well, first, they were the first real population centers. Previous to the monastic tradition, You just had kind of groups of people roaming, settling for a little bit, loosely connected, but there's no real population centers. And the monasteries became those centers, and they eventually became some of the major cities of Ireland, including Dublin, and Galway and Limerick. So those places that we're going to visit started off as monasteries. They would also, the monks were willing to educate anyone. You want to learn, come on in, you're welcome. So they were very open in that regard. And they were also, they tapped into this sense of Irish eccentricity, uniqueness, strangeness. There's this really, Cahill talks about Kevin the monk who lived in this tiny cave on the side of a cliff, and eventually got a bunch of followers, but kind of a crazy dude. Okay, and then they became centers of richness, of riches and learning, and one of the reasons that they became such centers of learning, and one of the reasons, central reasons, that the Irish were able to save civilization by saving Western literature, is that they were not concerned with orthodoxy. They were not, focused on, well, what are we supposed to do? What does the official church say that we should be reading and that we should be copying? And what does the official church say about how we practice our religion? They kind of viewed the Pope as the leader, but kind of a far-off guy who's not really involved in their day-to-day affairs, perhaps like President Miranda to most of you in your lives. So you had this kind of tradition of we're going to kind of do it our own way, and what that led to is the Irish would take in anything. Not only people were willing to learn, but they loved to copy books, and so they would copy any books, not simply religious books, not books that were moral in the way that you were told to be moral for a Catholic. If you got a book in, they would copy it, and they were really willing to learn the literature and the language of those texts. And so that welcoming, that openness, is what led to the preservation of many texts that a more Orthodox Catholic Church and Christian Church people would not have preserved. Okay, and so that's how a lot of the books came. And eventually, well, before I get to that, their unorthodoxy, their lack of orthodoxy, also extended to certainly the women. We've been talking quite a bit about that. That women were allowed to be leaders of the church, that women were allowed to run certain monasteries. And that would have been totally a no-go with the traditional Roman Catholic Church. Cahill talks about this really fascinating woman, Bridget of Kildare, who became eventually an abbess, leader of one of these monasteries, and she was utterly unattached to earthly wealth. She was willing to give away everything. She was giving away her father's stuff, and eventually her father's like, you are crazy. What is going on here? Tries to give her to this local king. The king says, what's up? She says, I'll give away all your possessions too. And the king's like, you take her back. So, an eccentric kind of woman for sure. And the lack of orthodoxy also extends to things like penance or reconciliation. Up to that point, if you wanted to be forgiven, you'd do it out in public. And everybody knew what you had done, and everybody knew what your punishment would be. And so generally, at that point in Catholic history, you received penance once. That's it. It's a one-time thing. And you don't sin after that, or at least you hope you don't. And the Irish said, no, let's bring it in. It's more personal. And you can be forgiven as many times as you need to be because, hell, we all screw up. We screw up all the time. And, we're basically all messing up and all sinners, and that's never going to change. And so the Irish said, yeah, keep it going. Let's forgive. So you had this culture. You had this unorthodox culture in terms of the practices, in terms of some of the rituals and some of the sacraments, and in terms of what they were willing to take in. And that was a huge, huge major part of how the Irish saved civilization. The other part was that after they collected all this learning, they were willing to go out and be missionaries, bring the church and the learning and the Western literature back to the place it came from, back to mainland Europe. And there was one monk in particular who, Cahill says, really is that link between the Europe that had died, the Europe that was being destroyed by barbarians, the Europe where books were burned, where cities were just rampaged, where buildings were taken apart, and the learning that had come from there, and the reintroduction of that learning. And that monk was, and I'll butcher this name, but Colomisu. And he was the guy who eventually left Ireland as part of a dispute, went to Scotland, and he must have had this incredible personality. People were attracted to him. People loved him. People were willing to follow him. And he kept on getting more and more followers. And eventually he had this rule that once the congregation he was in, the group he was in, reached 150, and you get 12 new people, 12 of those people, they got to go off and they got to, go to another place and start a new missionary. And this led to this incredible, I think Cahill says, 160 new missions were founded through him. So that's an incredible amount of people, an incredible amount of bravery as they spread out through England and then back into modern-day Europe. And eventually, that was a major reason why all these books, all this learning was brought back to Europe. What do they actually save? Well, they saved a bunch of the literature. They also saved the tradition of preserving your own national traditions and literature and stories. And for that, Cahill says, that we have much to be thankful, and the world would be a utterly different place, a less rich place, a less intellectual place than it is today, if not for those Irish monks. The book ends with Cahill talking about post-Irish greatness. So they had this moment, and what destroyed it eventually was the Vikings. The Vikings were perhaps ancient terrorists. They ruled by fear, by brutality, by butchery, and they saw the monasteries as places of great richness. And so they took and they plundered and they destroyed quite a bit of what the Irish had created. And Cahill says after that, Ireland never regained its status as a leading intellectual sites, as a place where scholars would go, as a place where civilization was preserved. It was just never looked at that way again. And Ireland becomes a place where oftentimes there's warring, there's internal struggle, there's battles, there's invasions, except for a brief period when Brian Boru, the great Irish king, ruled and unified Europe, or not Europe, but Ireland. They have this kind of struggle, this internal fight, and this tension. And then he just talks about all the invasions post then. The Normans from England invaded in the 12th century. They were actually kind of the best invaders that Ireland saw because they adopted many of the Irish traditions and became, in the end, more Irish than the Irish themselves. But then you had the Queen Elizabeth and the English, and that was a brutal rule, followed by the Cromwell and the Protestants, and much bloodshed. Then there was the penal laws, which really punished you severely for being Catholic, and which came close to destroying the identity, the Catholic identity of this nation. There was, in the 19th century, the Great Hunger, the Potato Famine, which killed over 1 million people, died of starvation. And then the struggle for independence continued into the 20th century, as Sister Marie talked to us about last week, the idea of the rising, and eventually leading to the place where Ireland is today, where it is a divided but independent nation, and a nation that has been scarred, a nation with great tension, a nation with great conflict, but perhaps emerging into a new place now as we visit it in the 21st century.